human heart is made for an epic story. And when we give up looking for that story, we give up living.
A few years ago, we watched the series Long Way Round. Watching those guys ride motorcycles across the face of the planet inspired us to go out and learn to ride. And always had this dream of maybe one day going on a trip like they did.
Don't have a background on GS bikes or off-road at all, and suddenly you get a call that the trip is happening. Not only that, we're collecting motorcycles.
It was incredible and terrifying all at the same time. It felt like we had begun stepping into the waters of something epic.
I am wildly unprepared for this.
And there was this constant fear that somewhere around me, some bike was going to go down really hard.
I can honestly say that I have never attempted anything as wild, foolish, beautiful, and bold. I've never done anything like this in my life.
We're creating something to give people insight into their whole life as a story.
I understood where they were coming from, because you can actually be so afraid of things that you can't even speak.
Airplane just takes a dive for the runway. Jet fuel spewing out, sparks going everywhere.
I look back over my shoulder because Padre's right behind me, and I see his front tires in the air as he's going across it. And he's going off. The bike's just going straight off the ledge.
Can we as a group do this? Can we get off this mountain? And feeling like the answer was no, we can't.
Oh, man.
Oh, man.
Hey.
Everybody's looking for a story worth living. Everybody. The human heart needs a story worth living.
And suddenly I get a call that the trip is happening. Not only that, we're collecting motorcycles.
Good. Nice and light on your bar.
The first time I rode a GS bike was about 2 months prior to the actual trip.
I've never done anything like this in my life.
Okay guys, this is the route that we're going to be doing this week.
We're going 11 Mile Canyon to the Globe and Anchor Ranch, then Bighorn Canyon down to the sand dunes, Wolf Creek Pass over to Durango, then Million Dollar Highway, Engineer Pass, Tin Cup, Leadville, Trough Road onto our ranch to the Wyoming border. It's 1,000 miles through some of the most gorgeous country you'll ever see, and it's going to test you big time.
The better the trip, the better the story. You kind of wonder, do we do all this stuff just so we can tell the stories? Does that make our life feel more meaningful?
We are 5 miles up this mountain, and the bike doesn't start up right away. At this point, going crazy enough, feeling bold enough that I pushed JD to let me try and ride it without any power off the mountain.
And just to give this context, like I had an engine and he was going significantly faster than me. I had to race to try and keep up because he was doing such a good job just carrying his momentum through, because he knew that there were some uphills and some water crossings, so just killed it.
Yeah.
Amazing.
So then, to make a long story short,
Right.
we've got hours to get...
It's not just that people love stories. Have you noticed? Story is the way we make sense of things.
Oh! What was that?
Well, so we were going along and go off the berm and then suddenly have this experience of like, oh my gosh, I don't know how to go off a jump. I don't know how to jump. I'm watching my front tire just kind of turn in the ugly and like, no, this is all wrong. This is all wrong.
Story is the language of humanity, the language of the heart. It's why people love movies so much. Everybody loves good stories. Now here's the big idea. If you're going to make sense of your life, it's going to happen through story.
We've been created by a storyteller, and that creator has created a creature who's not only bound to our own stories, but bound to other people's stories and bound ultimately to the great story. So our life and our story is somehow not only inscribed in terms of how we relate to others. I mean, you can't have a past without memory, and memories are just a settling of story. You can't have a future without some sense of anticipation, which is a kind of hope for what a story will end up to be. So as you think about your whole life, even your ability to remember facts, I mean, neurologically, we understand more so today that you don't just remember cognitively, you actually remember narratively. So our whole life, from the beginning to the end, is all about story.
We want to tell you a story, about your story. Everyone is looking for a story that makes sense of their life.
Feels so freaking good.
And like most stories, this one got a little out of hand. We got ourselves in a little over our heads.
Okay, on three. 1, 2, 3. I like that. That broken my leg in half. I know, it just... Hang on, that's correct. Yeah.
Which is a lot like our lives, really. Most of us feel in over our head at some time. How do we make sense of it all? Out here, we also found something else. We found a lot of clarity on the story of our own lives and the story we're living in.
Because it wasn't that I had had a bad day fishing and anything, I said, I don't know, and then out of my mouth came these words, I'll never find him out there. I had no idea that all those years I was looking for my father on the river.
Norman MacLean said that sometimes the best way to make sense of your life is to find a story that tells you about your story. Think about it. When they tell the story of your life, what kind of story do you want it to be? Everybody's looking for a story. Story is how we live our lives.
So how many gators do you guys have on site?
About 300 altogether.
300 gators?
Yeah. Like size-wise, this is one of the smaller guys.
Oh yeah, this one's just a baby. The other ones are like 12 feet.
So, like, will he bite my finger if I, like...
I don't know. How do you feel right now?
You know, I'm basically holding a dinosaur, so...
Don't let go.
Do you have any alligators who know how to ride motorcycles?
Well, I came down to Reno, and oh, hey, I seen my 4 lesson in patience and geography. From the bottom of the gutter to the top of OPP, had a lot of good times, but the freedom ain't freeloaded up. Pack it in and watch the stone roll down that hill again. The sun is shining inside.
Back in 2004, Ewan McGregor and Charlie Borman put adventure riding on the map when they rode BMW GS motorcycles all the way around the world. They made a series about their trip called Long Way Round. It's funny how a story can get you dreaming.
So watching those films, watching Ewan and Charlie drive across the face of the planet, inspired us to go out and learn how to drive motorcycles, and then always had this dream of maybe one day going on a trip like they did. Obviously, we weren't going to go around the world, but we were ready to.
So the trip for me started in December in the garage, huddled in a circle with the butane heater on, smoking cigars, and we began talking about trip ideas.
There was one little hitch, though. None of us owned one of these bikes, and 5 of us have never ridden off-road.
So going into the trip, my experiences were on 500cc and 600cc with about an cumulative maybe 10 hours of motorcycling experience, 15 if I'm generous. I am wildly unprepared for this. Blaine, you look like a stormtrooper.
Really?
Yeah.
You kind of have the TIE fighter pilot thing going on here.
It's pretty BA.
And you know what the life expectancy is for those guys.
Very small. But
Story gives us meaning. It gives us a sense of purpose and direction and belonging. Story gives us a sense of identity and community. It gives us a role to play. People give themselves over to pretty small stories and pretend that they're bigger than they really are.
We need a purpose for living. We have to have a sense that there is something bigger than our lives. If not, we begin to feel small and we begin to be lost. We literally begin to delude ourselves that what we're doing actually matters enough to continue to live. And centrally we know that's just not true.
So here's a classic example of small story. Just think about high school, right? Think back to high school. All of us, every desperate soul, just living in such small stories. I was the president of the drama club, and I won the award in my senior year for best actor. And that, my whole life revolved around the drama department, right? And so I was one of the drama geeks, I didn't care about the athletes, didn't care about, the academics. I had my little story, in which I thought I was playing this grand role.
My world, I was a jock. I played football on a team that won the state championship 3 years in a row. And that was sort of my life. And yet, all I can ultimately think of was I was trying to get a girl to like me, either through football or drugs, and it just didn't work.
For me, I figured out early on that I could sell people things. And so from probably my freshman year, I was the entrepreneur. And I just kept getting bigger and bigger. And I kind of prided myself in the fact that I probably made more money on weekends than a lot of my teachers did. There was a lot of arrogance and just sort of false validation that I got from that.
Yeah, I think for me the solution in high school was adventure. A particular moment, we're looking at the back of an Outside magazine and seeing an old photo of Yvon Chouinard and all those guys, Doug Tompkins, in their climbing gear, but also just in t-shirts and jeans, and went, that's my solution.
You are living out a story right now. There's no escaping it. That longing for the epic, that's a big part of why adventure has become so popular. Chasing the next big wave, the perfect powder days, looking for an epic story.
In fact, when we were planning this trip, it felt like the biggest thing we could do was to do it Australia, the outback, or drive down to Baja, and we just needed to go somewhere that felt exotic and big and powerful in and of itself.
Right, we were looking for an epic story.
But adventure isn't big enough to be your life story. You know you're living in a small story if you're the main character. The thing about all these smaller stories is they still prove the point. Everyone is looking for a story worth living. What's yours? We went out looking for beauty and adventure. Motorcycles and fly fishing through the best of Colorado. Life seems so much simpler on the road. You get into a rhythm. Rivers and aspen forests, sand dunes and the high passes, more beauty than a soul could take in.
Give me the impact of beauty. Like, what is this beauty doing? Like, it feels like it's just like almost healing my soul.
Right. You know, I said it down there, but let me say it again. Beauty really does conquer fear.
You're right. It's like when the other day when we got so hot and we were just drained and we jumped into cold water and you could just feel the life, coming against that drain feeling.
Right?
It's the same way with beauty and fear.
Yeah.
Totally is.
Totally.
I'm having a hard time keeping my eyes on the road as we're driving up this valley with just this carved, this stream running down it, a waterfall on the other side, green, verdant hills, and you're like, I need to stop because everything in me is going,
Take it in.
It also just feels like the beauty just calls you into it as you're going, because we've talked so much about finally getting on this. We're like, this is what we've trained for. This is what these bikes are made for. And to see the beauty of the valleys and see these huge landscapes open up, it's like this powerful draw to get up in them.
Well, in one sense, just looking around us is just beautiful. Anybody can enter the beauty around us. But what we've done to get to this spot, it's a lot of suffering, a lot of falls, a lot of fear being addressed, prayer, honoring our own labor to get through Rawhide. I mean, we've earned some degree. You don't earn beauty, but we've earned the suffering to be able to get to where
It's like
we
a
are.
higher appreciation because of the price that's been paid.
It's true.
if we'd taken the train into town and the gondola up here, this would be meaningless. We get our t-shirt, we get the snow globe, and then you'd walk away and have no impact on your life.
Our hearts are drawn to beauty, captured by beauty. When everything else in the world seems to make no sense, there is beauty. It speaks of a larger story. All those small stories people get trapped in, the most addictive ones are the stories that maximize our experience of beauty. And if the world was only filled with beauty, we wouldn't find it so hard to believe a good and kind hand was behind all this. But then there is affliction. This is where we really get confused about our own stories.
So, this is the canyon that my best friend was killed in 17 years ago on a trip just like this.
Brent was my closest friend. We spent years together backpacking, fly fishing, a lot of adventures. He was killed in a climbing accident on a trip we were leading.
That kind of thing can really mess up your understanding of the story that you think you're living in if you don't have something to help you interpret it.
This was the core of my fear about our adventure. I felt like it would happen again, that this was going to be my story too, or that it would happen to my sons. You see, it's the pain and fear in our lives that cause us to stay in small stories, safe stories, that give us just a taste of what we were meant for. We look for a taste of beauty and adventure, but underneath, there's a lot of pain.
You know, early on, I had a Huck Finn childhood, like moving from the city as an early young kid to a ranch style life, you know, and just having like freedom, like this place, just being able to do anything. And that was beautiful. Yeah. It was beautiful for the time until things change, you know, in my home life and with what woundedness that, you know, came upon me.
Right. I remember you saying once that as a boy, horses were safer than people.
I think the thing that helped me the most to get into them was I actually understood where they were operating from. Even at an early age, I think I understood what fear was, you know, and even at that age, you know, 6, 7 years old, my mom would come out to the barn and find me curled up on top of one of our old horses, just sleeping. And that was a comfortable place for me. That was a safe place.
So something about your life opened that door to know something about fear.
Yeah, I understood where they were coming from, because you can actually be so afraid of things that you can't even speak or walk or understand. And so I think where it really came to me with the horses was they didn't really care what color hair I had or where I'd been or anything. They just took you for what you were.
There was heartache.
Yeah, disruption. A lot of disruption in my home. Some of that came, you know, in many different forms. You know, with my parents, of course, their issues where they were at that time, and then just abuse. You know, abuse coming in my life at a very early age cut things really to the quick. And so trying to navigate that as a little boy, you know, with a very unstable circumstances in your home life, the horses were the place that I just gravitated to. That was safe. That was a safe place for me at that time. And I think at that point, I wasn't capable of that, taking that kind of risk anymore, you know, after abuse or not trusting men, period.
Well, you know, listening to your story, I feel a lot of grief, not just for you, but in many ways, my story, both of physical and emotional and sexual abuse, I just checked out, just as you put words to. I found early on that alcohol by age 10, 11 worked way better than having to feel what was inside.
Whatever your interpretation of the world is, whatever story you think explains it all, it has to reconcile beauty and suffering, love and loss.
That's a big cloud cell moving in our way, huh?
I know.
Question isn't, why is there so much suffering in the world? The real question is, why is there so much beauty?
I've got my Camelback, I've got my maps, I've got all my comm stuff, my radio, my camera, my spot, my gloves, I've got my backup batteries, I've got all my first aid stuff, my survival stuff, food stuff, all my stuff for my tent. And then I've got all the stuff for the bike. I've got my spare tires, my chain lube, my pump, the battery jumper box, spare levers, I've got 2 pouches of other tools, and then of course I've got my tank bag.
This trip had about 1,000 moving pieces to it. First, we had to come up with 6 GS bikes.
So you'll see that lines up on a notch, and then this has to line up in that little hole right there. This piece here. Are you okay with there being no spacer in here? Oh, this one's different.
And then we had to learn how to ride off-road on 500-pound machines.
It is Friday morning, about to head out to the training school.
5 of us have never done this before.
It's crazy how unwieldy it is on the gravel.
I'm a street rider. I've done almost nothing in the backcountry, nothing really on gravel.
None of this makes sense without the bigger story of the trip itself. You don't put all this together unless you're going somewhere.
Now back again.
We did all this so we could get to this. The bits and pieces of our lives don't make any sense without the story they fit into.
And it's those glands that are right next to the beaver butt. They secrete the fluid that marks their territory. We harvest like 400 pounds a year in the United States as a substitute for vanilla flavor.
That's so crazy. Beaver butts. Wait, you hit a beaver? Dad, did you just chime in? Yeah. Oh man, you can't come in the middle of a story.
You can't just walk in on the middle of a story. But that is exactly how most people experience their life. Like a movie they showed up to, 30 minutes late. Good things happen, bad things happen, and we just don't know how to make sense of it all.
The British playwright Tom Stoppard tells this story about his work where he says, a man owns a peacock farm and one day he's shaving himself when he looks out the window and one of his peacocks has escaped and is running down the highway. So he throws on his robe, dashes out the door half shaven, chases the peacock down, catches it. And I don't tell the story, Tom Stoppard says, from the perspective of the man shaving, and I don't tell the story from the perspective of the peacock. I tell the story from the perspective of the car passing at 70 miles an hour who looks out the window and sees a half-shaven man holding a peacock by the side of the highway.
Wearing a bathrobe.
Yeah.
Yeah, see, that's it. That's the postmodern dilemma, right? It's the people flying down the road. What? It's the loss of story.
Right.
The events of your life, both the good and the bad, are like scenes from a movie. If you don't have the rest of the movie, you can't make sense of your scene.
Hey guys, I just got to do this.
Movies are popular because they speak to the story need inside of us.
Luke, so love that. Star Wars has been such a huge part of our growing up, the story, the mythicness. Feels like we're on Tatooine right now.
So much fun. I just love even just pretending to be a stormtrooper out here in the dunes. Like, I've been trying to make stormtrooper armor out of cardboard since I was 4. And I just remember like growing up and using lightsabers, pretending to be Jedi up and down the street.
Yeah.
So fun.
The story has just always captured our imagination.
Yeah.
What is it? Epic stories, great trailers. It works. It captures something in our soul.
Totally. I think it's the hugeness. Luke and I have burned hours on road trips across the country just talking about Star Wars because none of the characters are dead ends. Yeah. They all open outwards and you dig into one character and find, wait, he got that gun from that character, and that's connected to the mythic trajectory of the universe in these ways.
Okay, that line, the mythic trajectory of the universe, like, that's it. And I think the reason that we love these things so much, the movies that we love, the stories, the novels, myths, legends, is that they are all saying one story. Like they're all speaking to one thing, right? Yeah. There's an epic battle, you know, of good and evil, right? That has to be fought. And then there's these small characters in an epic landscape that they get to rise up, right? And they get to play some valiant role. And then at the end of all of them, some incredible restoration, right? Like the Death Star's destroyed, or, you know, at the end of Lord of the Rings, Gondor is back in its glory and the king has returned. Yeah. Like, that's the gospel. Like that's the story that God is telling. Like, we are in story, and there's only one story, and the world just keeps retelling the same story in myth and fairy tale and poem and legend, and now, you know, the epic trilogies and those films. What we're actually describing here is there is a larger story, and we have a place in it.
Wow. Somehow we know the world is broken. We know we are. But somehow on stage or in a movie, we can somehow connect to the characters, but they also are telling something of the nature of our own story. We connect to the person because we know brokenness, but we also know that we're looking for redemption. Somehow the story itself from the brokenness is a search in some ways to see it all brought back together again. And so when that ending comes, when we know that finally restoration has occurred, I mean, our lives are given a perspective of this is what we were meant for.
And here is the incredible hope that the movies that we love, the stories that we love, the legends, the myths, they are all telling us something true about the universe. We do live in a great story. And what Jesus was trying to get across to the human race is there is meaning. You are part of something great and good, right? And heroic rescue through his life and death and resurrection. We are rescued and are now called up into a great story. Yes, there's a battle of good and evil. Just watch the news, right? Yes, you are needed. Small characters on an epic landscape. Like, we get to live in the greatest story of all.
Your life is like a scene from a movie or a chapter from a novel. Without the rest of the story, it will never, ever make sense.
Yeah, this is the last time I'll have signal. Cannot wait to see you.
Love you. Talk to you soon. Bye.
We live in a love story, set in a world at war. It is a love story, but our own stories of love shape our ability to believe that.
Texas Hold'em Ace as well?
Yep.
You get 2 cards.
This guy starts betting.
Oh, pair of aces starts the betting.
Oh, yeah.
$5.
I'll call that. I'll raise you 5.
No.
All right, what you got, big boy?
4 queens.
Oh, unbelievable.
Oh, yeah. come to Papa. There it is.
Love is the deepest yearning in the human heart. Therefore, we all have a story with love, and it tends to be a pretty mixed story.
Fours and twos? It's crazy, Luke, that you are getting married next summer.
I know, it's wild. Even now, just getting my head wrapped around the idea.
Does it not feel like the great unknown?
It is very much so the great unknown. I have no idea what I'm doing.
Right? How did you know? How did you know that she was the one?
First, I knew because I could not imagine a future that she was not a part of it. Nor could I have desires that were as rich as the desires I have that she is in.
Wow.
Yeah.
At the center of every person's story is the search for love, right? I mean, it might look like the search for, success, the search for praise or validation, affirmation, still the search for love. Or it can look like defensiveness and isolation and, I don't need anything or anyone. It's still defined by love. You're just pushing against it, right?
Yeah.
Love is the center of the story, every person's story.
I think about love. I think it's really made up of these two core components. We were meant for honor, to be honored, to be respected, and we were meant to be delighted in. And so wherever you experience honor and delight, you'll feel loved. But so often, most of us know that what delight comes, it's often based on what we've done, whether we performed well enough. Honor often has to cause us to kind of hide what we know is not really lovely inside of us. So we're in that bind. We want love, we're afraid, we don't want to risk, but we're meant for delight and honor. So with that, we're in this bind with love. Do we give? Do we receive? Do we allow it to grow? And so often we just take the tragic, safe road instead of opening our heart to what we were really meant for.
The biggest risk we ever take is the risk to love and to be loved. That's the biggest risk because it's the deepest desire. I mean, this is the core of our being. We live in a love story set in a world at war. Love is the core, right? And the war is always against love, right?
It feels like such a vulnerable thing to expose. Because that place where you feel delighted in feels like this thing that you hold so close, you don't let anybody else know because it's this secret source where you find that you're okay.
We're close to the center, aren't we?
Yeah, like to expose that is to be vulnerable in the place where you have been trying not to be vulnerable.
Right.
Yeah. We'll stay in.
Really? You're gonna be throwing darts?
Wow.
Threes are
Yeah,
wild.
buddy.
So your aces, right.
Awesome.
So, as we think about our story of love, the way it's shaped us, the way we're living now toward love or away from love, it becomes really clear that the biggest risk we ever take is loving and receiving love, and especially receiving unconditional love. And it is bigger than any risk we've taken on this trip so far, and any risk we will take, right?
If you think about your story as a love story, it's going to shed a lot of light on where your heart is living, where you're hiding, what you're looking for, and why.
I think going into this trip, I was afraid that when we finally got into the technical terrain, that some bike, or that my bike, would go down really hard.
Remember to get your butts back. Get your butts back. So give each other some space, guys, okay?
Blaine is a wilderness first responder medic. We're counting on him in case of serious injuries.
Careful on that guy. Whoa, 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 whoa.
As the trip was going on, it really changed, and there was this constant fear that somewhere around me, some bike was going to go down really hard, and we were going to have a really hurt rider. So when we were coming down Hurricane Pass, we're almost at camp, and finally starting to relax, and all of a sudden, Dan has this violent fall. He's down, his head cracks into the road. You can see he rips off part of his helmet. His pannier goes flying down. And John Dale is off his motorcycle, running to him in the ditch. I'm getting off my bike, grabbing the extra med kit, getting to Dan. So we give him a quick check. But it is really clear that some serious damage has been done to his side. And we touch the ribs, finally, and he just winces. You can see that he's in a ton of pain.
But we're a long way from any hospital or 911, and there isn't any cell signal anyway. What we wouldn't find out for days is that Dan had broken and separated 3 ribs and partially collapsed a lung.
And because of that event, it wasn't only that one of the things I was afraid of had come true, it made me more afraid for the next day when the stakes would be higher because we would be on a similarly difficult road, but we would be hanging off the side of a cliff. So I was terrified that I would be in the wrong place when something happened.
Fear is the great paralyzer. Fear is what causes us to stay in small stories, stories where we feel safe and in control.
So what's been the biggest fear on the trip so far for you?
For me, the moment that fear got in the most was doing Engineers Pass, doing those switchbacks. And the day before, I was talking with Sam, realizing that in 2 days of this trip, I have doubled the total amount of motorcycle hours I've accumulated in the last 4 years of having a license. And so I just remember this moment of coming around a turn and experiencing the fear of heights, cliff, 800 cc's of power underneath me that I'm supposed to have some sort of control over, and seeing a bike down in front of me and just feeling like I am wildly unprepared for this. But the other part of the fear was the fear of failure, of being the person that couldn't do it, being the person that was the low man on the totem pole. And so to like see that and feel my own experience, totally seized with fear. Seized with an inevitability of failure.
1, 2, 3, up.
For me, it was ridden a lot of the route before, ridden all of the route before, spent some of the most time on motorcycles, so there wasn't a fear of like, can I do this or not? It was, can the guy behind me do this or not?
Yeah.
Who happens to be your younger brother or your father or a friend? It really sucked to see you guys suffering and then bailing out or going off an edge. Like, that's where my fear was.
Sure.
And then of course all the responsibility that bears.
Yep.
Of you were the one that chose this route. You were the one that brought them here.
Have you noticed as we're talking how Blaine medically, I won't be there, JD and Sam, I chose the wrong route. This is going to be my fault. That Luke, I'm going to be the low guy on the pole. Isn't it interesting for men how deeply connected fear is to failure?
Yeah, I found on Engineers Pass going up, especially with this group of caliber of men, performing a very physical and technical task, fear felt like the voice telling me that I could not be a part of that, and therefore felt like failure, frustration, anger, and I almost like wanted to go faster or wanted to go like up, screw the switchbacks, I'm just gonna go up it, to violently assault that voice.
We often make decisions on the basis of what in the brain is called the limbic system. And it may sound a little technical, but there are 2 parts of that limbic system. The hippocampus, which basically sort of walks you through events of your life story-wise. Here's what happened, and we resolved it, and it's all well. But you have another part of your brain, the limbic system, called the amygdala, and it's basically on edge every freaking second. Like it's going, snake, tiger. But the hippocampus is going, oh, we've been down this path before. You're okay. You're gonna make it, buddy. And the amygdala literally needs comfort. It needs the ability to rest and relax. And therefore, when Jesus says, fear not, I am with you, he's not saying, don't be afraid. He's simply saying, now will you receive my comfort, my care, my generosity, so that you can allow that tenseness, because that's what adrenaline, the catecholamines, cortisol, is what it makes you tight. And certainly, my big accident of this trip came because I hit a rock and I tightened. So my fear afterwards has been every rock that would move my tire. And JD helped me so much by simply saying something simple, relax. Really what you were saying is, let Jesus care for your fear with kindness. And you'll then begin to relax and let the movement of the bike do what it's naturally built to do. We can't conquer fear, but we can receive kindness and generosity for fear.
It's huge that the solution to fear is not perfection, but the solution to fear is mercy.
We all have a story with fear, what brings fear, and how we handle it. Sometimes we hide, hang back, and stay in a safe story. Sometimes we push ourselves too hard to try and overcome fear, which usually only makes it worse. Maybe it's heights, maybe it's losing someone, maybe it's getting really sick. Everyone has a story with fear. Fear actually opens us up to our need for someone greater than us to be there for us. Will we let him?
It must have been a rock or something, but you were like, you didn't do anything wrong. It just happened. It was violent. Like, you went down harder than anybody else today has gone down.
We had just come up over Hurricane Pass, and we're looking down the road on the far side, and I see Dad go down hard. And immediately have this experience of this heavy, dark feeling beginning to fill the scene. There was fear, there was the pressure to film, and I began to feel like things were unraveling, but mostly in a relational and a spiritual sense, where some of the really gnarly darkness that we were going to encounter was right ahead of us and was beginning to hit us.
Every story, from popular movies to the nightly news, all share one thing in common: the presence of evil in the world.
The most beautiful days of riding were also the most horrible days. They were so spiritually opposed, and there was such a palpable sense of hatred and antagonism as we were riding that even in the midst of this incredible beauty, this horrible feeling filled the scene, and it was cloudy and threatening, and the sense of constant foreboding and constant thwarting. And internally, I was feeling so afraid that someone was about to become horribly injured, but also just personally feeling this confusion, this malaise, like a fog had descended. And it was a horrible thing to ride in. When we got to the top of Engineer Pass, I didn't want to stay a minute.
You will never understand your life or your own story without understanding evil. There is a dark force in the world set against the human race. It's not just that bad things happen. Evil feels personal, intentional, and it is.
You just roll right down the middle of that.
Yeah, okay.
It's going to be okay.
All right.
How do you feel?
Sometimes the attack comes as accusation. The shame, the guilt, all that negative stuff we get hammered with.
The intensity of the spiritual warfare I have never experienced before in my life, and part of me wishes I never do again. It was amazing how quickly each emotion that I felt that was negative was inflamed to a dramatic level, where I crashed my motorcycle and what would normally be like, oh dang, was immediately just this like noise in my head of accusation and frustration and senses of failure, and then other experiences of doing things that I can totally do, that I'm totally capable of, all of a sudden became super hard.
Sometimes it comes as a sort of dread or fear, a darkness we just can't seem to shake. I lost my best friend on an adventure trip like this, and I kept having this dark feeling that it was going to happen again. We began to feel the presence of darkness. We began to feel hunted. We could feel death trying to get in. This is one of the most basic and essential pieces to understanding your own story. You have an enemy. Ignore this, and you will never understand why things are happening the way they are.
Even riding on Hurricane Pass, I was aware that anyone seeing this will misinterpret what they see if they equate the antagonism with something on the level of dehydration. If I'm having bad thoughts, if I'm just afraid, if the adrenaline is finally starting to ebb and I'm dealing with some of the hard riding. I'm not talking about bad thoughts. I'm not talking about disappointment. What we were riding up against was a pronounced and a violent antagonism. I mean, a villain set against the joy we were pursuing in this project.
Either you admit there's an enemy, or something else becomes the enemy. You blame family, or other people, another race, politics, even God.
You know, evil seemed to be working to rewrite this story, a story of joy and beauty and goodness, by the fact that it felt like me and others had a hard time with the skill level and the kind of terrain we were riding on. That question of, you're disqualified. You are not meant to be here. You have no right to be here. You have no right to be doing what you're doing. You are a fool. I mean, that sense of foolishness was there, and a bitter, acrid taste, at least for a little bit, each and every day at times, and only through prayer, only through being able to come together as a team, that I feel like there was any dissipating of that darkness.
Evil is real, and evil is personal. Satan is always working to steal, kill, and destroy. So what are you doing to actively resist him?
Father, that we ask with all the holy saints that we would have power to be able to make our way down with joy. We stand against the thief who has been working virtually every minute to steal joy. We claim joy as a result of what you have done on our behalf, and ask in your name that you would infuse in every heart here a sense of the goodness of what we have already accomplished, what we will accomplish even through the end of this day.
Runs on air?
Yeah, it's a pneumatic tool, and it runs off compressed air.
So what do you do with all of it?
Oh, there's probably a dozen different tools you can buy. I think I've got 2 or 3 of them.
I feel like I'm on the moon, because when I talk about tools, my tool chest is like a 2-quart plastic bag with a couple screwdrivers.
Yeah.
So when I look around and kind of marvel, stunning. What does this place say about you?
Yeah, Dan, part of it is, I think it's a chase for validation. Part of it's desire, and part of it is, I want to do something. I want to come through. I want to be the guy. I want to do that, and I want to risk.
Why did that come out? I have no idea why, but enough of the rattling.
Some men are confident with tools, some with motorcycles, some with finances. We all look for a place we feel confident, and we stay there until we get disrupted.
Bart, I'm pretty sure that's not a chandelier. What's the prop?
Yeah, Dan, I call that my prop of shame. There's a story of deep shame in that, but of redemption as well, and that's why I have it. I wanted a more reliable plane, and so I actually found somebody who had re-engineered and rebuilt the platform that I was flying. They put a turbine engine on it. That's a turbine prop. We were landing at the place where they build these airplanes. Very short runway. It had been snowing. They had to plow the runway, a lot of ice and snow on it. So he says, okay, you want to get on the ground pretty quick because short runway, and then you want to go into beta, which is reverse thrust. That is a new thing in a turbine airplane. I didn't have beta reverse thrust, where the prop actually reverses and it pushes the air out and stops you very quickly. And so as I came over the numbers, I had the reaction that I had hundreds of times in my old airplane as I pulled all the power back and I hit the beta lock and went through the beta lock in the air. Went into reverse thrust. Airplane just takes a dive for the runway, and that's the prop that you see there. We careened down the runway about 1,000 feet and go into a snowdrift, and jet fuel spewing out, sparks going everywhere. We weren't hurt. We climbed out of the airplane. Gear had collapsed. The plane was a wreck. And so the next day I went to the instructor and I said, are you okay? I'm really sorry I did that. He said, yeah, I'm okay. He said, I thought we were dead. But he said, do you realize what you were doing when we were careening down the runway? I said, no. He said, you were hitting the top of the dashboard with your fist, screaming at yourself. You worthless piece of shit. You worthless piece of shit. And when I got back to the team and we started chasing that down, we found a very, very young wound in my heart of when my brother would shame me with that saying. And I had this agreement that I was this self-hatred, this self-reproach, and it came bubbling out.
Well, I think the number one thing that most people do to cover shame is they turn to their own self-contempt or they turn to contempt toward others. So contempt becomes sort of our shield, our covering, that pressure to perform, yet on the other side, I'm gonna make sure that nobody else sees, and I'm gonna hate what shows that weakness, and then I'm gonna work really, really hard. So hatred, contempt, almost a violence against ourselves pushes us to perform, to succeed, and then when we don't, that kind of violence, that I am a shit, that I think is so revelatory, what's truly there.
I mean, I got a confession. So, like getting ready for this trip, like I actually went out and practiced in secret. I found a dirt lot in town that you guys didn't know about, and I would go down there and I practiced my turns on those big heavy bikes because I didn't want to be the idiot on the trip.
I can totally relate to this, especially in the world of academia, where I'm in currently, where performance, but mostly intelligence, is the route to having worth. So in some of my tougher classes, and frankly in all of my classes, I read everything twice. Most people don't read. I read everything twice. And then I go back and memorize my annotations, just to make sure that in every class, I am known as competent, as intelligent, and in that intelligence, powerful.
Shame is where we feel exposed. That's something inside of us that's pretty hideous and ugly, that we've spent our lives pretty much hiding, kind of comes to the surface. And as a result, we're now exposed and we're gonna get what we expect other people to bring us. In many ways, many of us spend our lives trying to cover over what we know inside is this brokenness that we've got to hide.
We're all working pretty hard to make sure that the world sees us in a certain way.
Bart, do you use all of the tools in here? I mean, I see wrenches the size of my forearm of every dimension and size. There's a part of me that kind of goes, I'm intimidated, and also, when do you use that particular
Look, those big tools?
Yeah.
Well, there's one job for that, and that's on the Caterpillar outside, and it's to adjust the treads on it. And,
Caterpillar? You have a caterpillar?
Yeah, Dan.
I mean, not like the thing that grows into a butterfly?
Yeah, would you like to drive it?
No.
I think you'd love it.
Talk about fathering.
You would love it.
I spend my life in the academy in order to be intelligent. That's my world. I escape the world of mechanics, and certainly I can't say that I've ever been conscious of this, but escaping caterpillars.
And it's one of those mountains you think I could never climb, but you get in that seat and you'll climb that mountain pretty easily.
Let's see.
Everybody wants to feel competent. Nobody wants to feel like a fool. So we all find a place where we know what we're doing, and we hide there.
I love it. Look at them.
Real courage isn't doing flips on your motorcycle. Real courage is coming out of hiding.
Now what?
Welcome back inside the head and genius of Blaine Eldridge. We're getting ready to take off. Some people think that these particular ships are inappropriately equipped for this kind of lunar voyage to sail, like so many pentacons among the stars of Elysium.
Hey, we're good to go.
Ah!
Can you hear them calling? Oh, the clearest winds blow. We're playing hard for keeps. We've got visions and dreams. You gotta get up. It's time to go.
On this motorcycle trip, each day felt like 4. The amount of time was stretched out. And that was because it wasn't just a group of buddies riding motorcycles for a week of camping. There were so many other things going on with the headsets and technology, with needing to do things again for the filming, with the spiritual aspects, with needing to sit down and be honest and vulnerable in my experience of the trip to a camera.
We took this trip because it was a long-time dream of ours, but we also did it to create these films. Sure, we wanted to share in an adventure, but we also wanted to make films for you, to help you understand your story, to maybe find a bigger story.
No, we're good. We're done, guys.
How did this all get started?
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, if you'd have looked at my life initially, you probably wouldn't have seen it from the disparate pieces. I didn't. I ran a theater company in LA, and I loved it. It was our life. And then it broke my heart when we had to shut it down in my 20s, and I was devastated. So I just went and got a job as a journalist. Went to Washington, D.C. and covered stories, and that wasn't it either. Like, that didn't speak to my heart. But as I look back now, I can see it was all about story.
Yeah.
Right? Like, theater was all about telling great stories. And then, you know, journalism was exposing the stories.
Right.
And then going into counseling, right? It's people's stories and uncovering the story and bringing them understanding of their story, right? So I look back at it now and go, oh, the hand of God was in all of that. I wish I had had somebody at the time interpret that for me, like point to the desires of my heart, help me understand, no, God is shaping you through this experience, all of that through your life. You can develop a sense of mission as you look at how God's shaping what you're made for, what you're designed to do.
The whole point of understanding your story is so that you can be intentional with where it's headed.
Tell us, how did you become a psychologist? How did that fit into your story?
Luke, you know the normal saw about psychologists, that we're all troubled, come from troubled worlds. And at least in my case, it's very true. My mom was delightful at times and could be violent and crazy at other points. Could be empty and desperate, or just confident and sweet. So I lived in a world that just had no predictability, no stability. And I became really quite good at being able to read her emotion, read her face, know when it's best to simply slip out of the house without eating breakfast because there would be too much madness. I was always intrigued by pathology. So being a psychologist was simply a natural extension of sort of the themes that God had built already into my life. I could have chosen other worlds, but this fit me best in that sense of who I was called to be on behalf of the larger story. What about you, my friend?
For me, it's always been my love of fairy tale. Growing up in a house of just books and reading and stories and even movies and things like that. And nothing has been able to move me like a good story can. And so first I wanted to be an author of fairy tales. But as I engaged with learning, I discovered love for medieval literature. Yes. Yeah, as I discover in these books and these old stories, the kind of things that I love. And so it is desire to pursue that more. However, where that is going, I do not know.
Well, one of the best ways at times is to look at what the opposition is that you find regularly showing up in your life. Certain assaults, accusations, struggles, where you know evil is at work to thwart you. If you look at the debris that evil brings, often it's working against what you're most meant to be engaging.
Finding your mission, your place in the larger story, will be profoundly opposed. It may be the most opposed thing you ever face, second to love, of course, and your life with God. But you can use the opposition to help you discover your mission. If you look back with compassion and curiosity, you'll see that there is a theme to your life.
Don't you forget what you've come for. Don't you forget where you've been. This road is will take you back home again. Hugging to the shoulder line, shooting out the lights, a little tired, a little low, counting down to Friday night. Ain't knowing where you're going, time's just seeing where you've been. Alabama, third quarter through the back door of a bank. Let it roll, rolling on again. Let it roll.
I loved that last 45 minutes. Like that,
glorious.
I had so much joy again.
Myself, yeah.
30 minutes left on dirt
Right.
for the whole 1,000 miles, guys. What are you looking forward to tonight at the ranch?
A bed? Like a real bed?
I'm really looking forward to a shower to get clean.
Oh my
gosh,
gosh, a
the
shower.
accumulative sweat and dirt and grime.
I know I want to see Becky, that's number one, but if I didn't take a shower beforehand, there'd be no contact, emotionally or otherwise. The ride was phenomenal. I wouldn't trade it for a million. But I think the thing that I'm going to feel the loss is not to wake up in the morning and see your faces. The companionship has been one of the sweetest parts of this trip.
Yeah, as I got out of my tent this morning and saw the motorcycle sitting there in front of the rocks, it struck me. Like, I'm sure I'll go on other trips, but it won't be a trip quite like this with men like this.
Living in a larger story means living with a sense of anticipation. How will your story end?
Hey guys, the gals are preparing a party for us tonight.
That's awesome. I cannot wait to see Amy. Oh.
I'm sorry, Luke, someday.
They were talking about how excited they were to see their wives and how much they were anticipating it. And the entire time I was just bitter and envious. And so whenever any person made a comment about how excited they were, I would make a sarcastic comment or be grudgy or just scoff.
Luke doesn't know that we've flown in his fiancée Olivia as a surprise. For a story to be really good, it needs to be headed to a wonderful ending. Without that, you're just stuck in the journey forever.
You made it!
Made it, love.
And as you can tell,
You got a good spill?
covered in mud.
Yeah, I am too now.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh, when we pulled in to the ranch and Olivia was there, I almost dropped my motorcycle from the shock and surprise.
Oh my gosh! Oh my gosh! Oh my gosh! Hey! Hey!
And then it was joy and delight, feeling like I did when I was a little boy on Christmas morning.
Look at his face!
Oh my gosh!
They're so cute. So I'm gonna keep it just like that.
Awesome.
It's awesome.
I like it.
Yeah, it's
Makes
awesome.
it better.
Mr. Farley, why are you punching?
Yeah, so I've been living in this gear for the past 8 days.
wearing new clothes
I
today.
do. I smell terrible.
Amen. The toast is to our valiant women.
Yes.
Holding us up from afar. For your faith, for your hope, for your love. Thank you. Cheers, friends. Cheers.
JD, Luke, Sam, Blaine. Like, no, they go up Targan's Fang. They'd have to deal with the Eagles. Wide-eyed.
A really good celebration remembers the losses and the hardships and savors the victories.
So, Dan is doing the technical stuff. He asks JD and goes, wow, is this kind of like what engineers gonna be like?
Silent.
You know, this is good practice.
Same road, we're kind of flying, we're kind of getting the hang of these things. I lay a bike down, and all of a sudden we hear Blaine go, whoa, 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 whoa. I'm okay, I got it, I'm good.
So after that, when we arrived to Bart's, fantastic story of, we had a thing called tannerite, which is an explosive that explodes when it's impacted by a high velocity bullet. And when we were doing this, Bart was shooting this gun, but he wouldn't hit it in the first couple shots. And so the anticipation of bang, nothing, bang, nothing. But when it went, oh my gosh, explodes into color.
He hits a load of tannerite and he sends a blue barrel 100 feet into the air. Boof, boof, and this barrel is up in the air, and like we're like hiding behind like tractors and stuff.
Let's be clear, some of that shrapnel was hitting pretty close to us.
A story is only as good as its ending. What are some of your favorite endings to stories that you love? Movies, fairy tales? I'd love to hear a couple.
For me, I read The Lord of the Rings this year, and the ending in the book to that is incredible. As Frodo, who has endured so much suffering on behalf of others, is going to the Grey Havens, going to a second Eden, and going there, the last lines of the entire series is, he heard the sound of singing voices and a landscape under a swift sunrise. Yeah.
So I really love the Return of the Jedi ending because they're all celebrating with the Ewoks.
Right?
And like the whole like Yoda and Anakin and are all back in there and
they're back.
And it's a big party.
Right?
In a tree house.
Right.
It's pretty great.
So, one of my favorite endings is the musical Les Mis.
Oh, come on.
When everyone who has gone before, who's died, is back together and they're singing the anthem. And it's just such an amazing picture.
It's so obvious that we are made for restoration. I mean, the endings speak of the fact that every really good ending has something of evil being addressed and vanquished. And something about those who were divided being brought back together again. And that complexity of justice and mercy and goodness really is the core of the sweet desire every one of us has when all things are put well and good again.
That's just huge. That's huge, because as we were driving in, we were a couple hours yet from the end of the trip, 1,000 miles, and so much in 8 days. I was just tearing up. I didn't want it to end. I hate it that things end. I hate goodbyes, right? I hate the ending of things.
Yeah, talking about this, I want to read something. One of my favorite books, the last section of the last chapter of the last Chronicle of Narnia. And for us, this is the end of all the stories. And we can most truly say that they all lived happily ever after. But for them, it was only the beginning of the real story. All their life in this world and all their adventures in Narnia had only been the cover and the title page. Now, at last, they were beginning chapter 1 of the great story, which no one on earth has read, which goes on forever, in which every chapter is better than the one before.
This life we're living is partial at best. Good times always come to an end. Every small story comes to an end. And though our age has become cynical, deep in our hearts, every person longs for the happily ever after. Are you living with a sense of anticipation? What are you looking forward to? How do you want your story to end? What if it doesn't have to?
1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. If I had wings like Noah's doves, I'd fly the river to the one I love. Oh, fare thee well, my honey, fare